Hello. As countries, they are the closest of diplomatic allies, brothers in arms in some of the biggest international conflicts of the past 20 years. But a refugee deal, previously agreed by President Obama with the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, provoked some very undiplomatic language from President Trump. Mr. Turnbull thought America accepting asylum seekers from Australian processing centres was in the bag. Not so fast, said Mr. Trump, tweeting that he would study what he called a dumb deal. Things reportedly went from bad to worse, with President Trump either hanging up or certainly abruptly ending his first phone call with the Australian PM, and later describing it as the worst by far of his calls with world leaders. So, how did Mr. Turnbull think it went?
I think the Australian public would be interested in your relationship with our most important partner. Did he hang up the phone to you earlier than you expected?
Look, I'm not going to comment on these reports of a conversation. Australians know me very well. I always stand up for Australia in every forum.
This report says some pretty incendiary things, like that he said it was the worst conversation he'd had for that day, and he asked you if you were going to try to export the Boston bombers. I mean, do you have a comment on that?
Look, I'm not going to comment on a conversation between myself and the President of the United States, other than what we have said publicly.
Australian Prime Minister there refusing to rise to journalists' questions about that particular phone call. Well, with the view on the deal from Sydney, our correspondent Phil Mercer has this report.
The deal that has so infuriated Donald Trump was signed with the outgoing Obama administration in November of last year. The terms of that agreement would be that the United States would resettle more than 1,000 refugees from Australia's 2 offshore processing centres, one on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and the other on the tiny Pacific Republic of Nauru. Now, Mr. Trump says that the agreement is dumb and that he'd be looking into it. And it seems that this agreement was the source of a very testy telephone conversation between the US President and the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull over the weekend. The Washington Post is reporting that Mr. Trump apparently accused the Prime Minister, Mr. Turnbull, of trying to export the next Boston bombers to the United States. Mr. Turnbull has been on Australian radio in the last few hours, giving very little away about the conversation. He did, though, say that the discussion was frank and forthright. He's also, Mr. Turnbull, denied media reports that the US president put the phone down on him at the end of the conversation. Mr. Turnbull saying that the call ended in a very courteous way. The broader implications for this, we don't know if the refugee deal will survive, and we don't know how Australia will be reacting to Donald Trump in the future, given that the military alliance with the United States is at the core of Australia's national security. So America is one friend that Australia simply can't live without.
Phil Mercer, rather. Let's speak to the journalist Mary Jordan, who's from the Washington Post, the newspaper that broke this story about that phone call. Do you stand by your sources? I mean, some people are even suggesting this was a leak you had from the White House.
Well, it kind of looks like that. And, I mean, if the only issue is whether he cut the call short, as we reported, or actually hung up on him, it's really about the content of the call. You know, it's an extraordinary time in Washington when you have kind of a gentle, lovely conversation between the President of the United States and Putin, and you have this kind of what many people call kind of a childish harangue, where he's telling him about his big electoral win and saying, you know, this is the worst call I've had so far with anybody. I mean, obviously, Australia is a close ally, and people just are shaking their heads over here.
Yeah, I mean, so this was a pre-existing deal which President Obama had signed off, and Malcolm Turnbull, just explain it for our viewers, Malcolm Turnbull thought that that deal still stood, did he?
Yes, and there's confusion today about whether Donald Trump will stand by it. I mean, Obama signed this order saying that we would help settle these refugees. And now Donald Trump says, you know, I don't like this. and he made that clear. But it's unclear here about a lot of things in these extraordinary, tumultuous days, whether he's going to stand by it or not. There's, I mean, it could be that the leak is all about saying, look, you know, Obama signed this, I don't like it, but I may go through on it.
It's an interesting one, isn't it, for both men, actually. I mean, for Trump, I suppose his team will say this shows that he's doing business in a different way, regardless of how close your allies are. For Malcolm Turnbull, also, if he stands up to this, it'll look good for a Prime Minister who's not doing that well in the polls either.
Well, precisely. And, I mean, it's very divided here in America about this travel ban, too. You know, half the people are protesting so violently, they're practically crying, saying this is not our country, we're not about this. And half the people, those who supported Donald Trump, applaud it, say that they're really worried that a terrorist could come through. So Donald Trump seems, in leaking this, if it is coming from the White House, in saying, you know, I understand, I inherited this, but I don't like it.
OK, just on that point, I mean, can you confirm it did come from the White House? Is that where you got the story from?
No, I'm not. I can't confirm that. We would never confirm sources. But I'm just saying
I just thought I'd ask, that's all.
OK.
OK, Mary Jordan, thank you very much indeed.